I see another Linda Smith with their hand raised.
No, I think it was the same Linda. I just lowered the hand.
Oh, okay. Hello, Vivian.
Hey, Wayne, haircut.
Yes, that is true.
It's my first observation of you for the evening.
Okay. So we
No haircut.
yes. So it is 7:07 and we have quorum. So I'm going to call the meeting to order. I'd like to welcome everyone. I'm, Wayne Benjamin. I chair the Land Use Committee for Manhattan Community Board 12, and joining me this evening are committee members Vivian Ducat, Jim Berlin, and Tanya Bonner, and also with us is board member Sally Fisher. We have there was an item on the agenda, which was a presentation concerning the inward section of the Manhattan Waterfront Greenway. That specifically was requested to present to land use in May, but it is postponed to the June meeting as of yesterday. So we just have a couple of items on the agenda, and one of which is the approval of the minutes of the April meeting, which we unfortunately were not able to get to the full board for the last meeting. I have received comments from Vivian and from Steve Simon. Give me a second. And I also received a response from Jim Berlin indicating that he has no comments. Steve Simon has just joined us. Steve, we're on to the approval of the minutes, and I was just sharing with everyone that the comments received from you and from Vivian are the ones that I have. Jim did respond indicating he had no comments. Are there any other comments on the minutes? And if not, I will accept a motion to accept the minutes of the April 2022 Land Use Committee meeting as modified.
I move we accept the minutes as modified.
Is there a second?
I second it.
Is there any further discussion? So the committee members in favor of approval, please say aye or raise your hand. Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed or abstaining? They are approved. Thank you. The second item on the agenda is a matter that we postponed from last month's meeting, although we talked about it briefly, and that was the committee's suggestions for contextual zoning for the areas of Washington Heights between 155th Street and 177th Street that are currently zoned R8. And as was discussed at actually last month's general meeting and its several meetings throughout the last year, the area, the southern part of that, there are two pending developments, one of which is a 17-story residential building, one of which is a 13-story residential building. And those buildings are perfectly consistent with the R8 zoning because the R8 zoning does not impose any height limits. And as we discussed years ago, when a soft site analysis was done, this section of Washington Heights and Inwood is the only section that is zone R8. There's a small other area on Amsterdam Avenue, but that was done, I believe, in the 70s for a particular development that is consistent with that zoning. However, the R8 zoning allows for density that is almost double of the R72, which is the rest of the community. The community board passed a resolution in January reiterating prior requests for the Department of City Planning to look at and consider rezoning the R8 area. City Planning got back to us and asked for our suggestions as to what we would think is appropriate. I shared some reference materials with the committee for last month's meeting. We discussed them briefly and asked everyone to review those and be prepared to share their comments on what they think is appropriate. So with that, I'm interested in hearing what my committee members think about what are appropriate options. I see Steve's hand went up first.
Wayne, it looks to me as though maybe the most feasible thing we could advocate for with respect to the two sites that are most vulnerable at 158th Street and around the corner at Riverside Drive might be the R8B contextual district. And according to the material that you sent to us, this is a zoning designation that was designated to preserve the character and scale of older row house neighborhoods, and which seems to apply in this case. These districts allow the construction of buildings with heights of roughly 6 to 7 stories, which would be, I think, far lower than what's being planned by the owners there, and with a slightly higher FAR than R7B. So any new buildings constructed must be quality housing buildings. Contextual bulk controls produce buildings that either preserve or create a context similar to older row house and tenement buildings. These districts are often, but not exclusively, mapped along narrow streets and are found primarily on the mid blocks of the Upper West Side, Upper East Side, and Lower East Side of Manhattan. I mean, I don't know, 158th Street maybe it would not be considered a narrow street.
Actually, it is.
But it is. All right, then it seems to me that that might be the most suitable designation. It's an R8 designation, but it's R8B, which is meant to be a contextual district.
Right. Any zoning district with a letter after it is contextual, whereas any zoning district that just has a number is height factor, meaning there, as long as you set back and don't break the sky exposure plane, you can go as high as you want.
And if I could just make one other point, if we're going to talk about rezoning the entire stretch from 155 to 177, I'm not really sure what other sites we have that might be available for development, but it seems to me that we might have to advocate for maybe different zoning wider streets. So that seems to be what's being called for here. Like the R7D is also a contextual district, but it's geared towards wide streets, and apparently was created in or has been applied to Hamilton Heights to the south of us. So, but I can see maybe R7D being appropriate on the west side of Broadway and maybe on Fort Washington Avenue, and not on the side streets, but on the wider avenues.
Thank you, Steve. I think the next hand was Jim and then Tanya. Or at least that's the way it's showing up on my screen.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Let me just get this back on my screen, this zoning thing. So to begin with, this entire district is pretty much, other than the part we're talking about now, R7 something. So as far as I'm concerned, anything that's R8 something now or just R8 should be R7 something, because I don't think we need any more bulk than R7 allows. So that's number one. Now, as to the various, as Steve alluded to, the two that are tolerable are the R7A and the R7B. The one that's totally intolerable is the R7X. And if you go look at the materials Wayne sent, or you just go back to that, find that thing on Google, the building that they show, from my point of view, is like 12, 15 stories. It's huge. In fact, here you go. It's this thing. That that's beyond. So as far as I'm concerned, R7, no R, and this is just my opinion, of course, no R8, nothing at all. R7X, definitely not. Probably don't want any R7D, and the A and the B are another story. That's my 2 cents. Thank you.
Thanks, Jim. Tanya.
Yeah, I just wanted to, I don't know if people here who are attending, know what we're talking about. So I was just wondering, maybe perhaps just a brief description of what the zoning is currently, and then what are some of the potential options to replace that, just so there's more of a descriptor of what we might be considering.
Yeah, well, that's sort of what I attempted to do, but I can give a bit more detail. So along those lines, as we discussed, if you look at all of Washington Heights and Inwood, and for that matter, a lot of Upper Manhattan, and that's true before community boards 9, 10, and 11 went through a series of rezonings probably in the last decade or so. Most of the zoning was R7-2, and that's a medium density residential zoning. And in terms of any of the attendees who have participated in any of the land use committee meetings over the last 10, 12 years, or who have looked at the planning study that we worked on with City College in like around 2006 or so, know that one of the things that we were looking to do, one of the things that came out of that planning study, was to balance the neighborhood's needs for new development with preserving neighborhood scale and character. And what we are talking about specifically here is there is a section of Washington Heights and Inwood that has zoning that is different than the R7-2. The area west of Broadway, from 155th Street to 177th Street, was zoned R8 in 1961 when the rest of the city went through the rezoning. Why that area was R8 and everything else was R7-2, I don't know. R7-2 allows you a density, and density, or the FEI, is just a multiplier. If you have a site that's 10,000 square feet and you have an FAR of 3, it means you could build 3 times the 10,000. So R7-2 allows you a density of 3.44, I believe. R8 allows you a density of 6.5, if I'm not mistaken. So it's a higher density. And you might say, well, why does that really matter when you consider how built up the neighborhood is already? Well, interestingly enough, when Scott Stringer was borough president, and we had a planning fellow and we did a soft site analysis, one of the things that was pointed out is because the R8 zoning allows for higher density, some of the existing buildings are only built to, 50 or maybe 70% of, the maximum allowable density. And so they're potentially, they're not vacant sites at all, but they are potentially sites for new development. And it really depends on what market conditions are like. And if you look at current market conditions where the average rent in Manhattan is $3,000 a month, the market conditions are such that, it might be financially feasible for someone to purchase an existing building, to have the building, vacated, which may take time, and then build a new building. In the instance of what Steve was talking about, and once again, attendees who've attended any number of meetings or who have been involved in some of the community discussions, there is a building at 857 Riverside Drive. It dates back to, probably before the United States of America was the United States of America. It's a single family frame house built by an abolitionist, was subsequently occupied by abolitionists, and really should be something that is designated and protected. It is not. So on that site of a single family, wood frame house from the 1700s, there's a proposal for I think a 17-story residential building. On 158th Street, directly adjacent to the Audubon Park Historic District, there's a series of row houses which Community Board 12 advocated should be included in the historic district back when the historic district was designated in 2009, but LPC did not follow our advice. I think, and Vivian, you can correct me if I'm wrong, I think at least 4 of those buildings are now owned by a single owner, as well as a large lot that is behind them. And on that site, there is a 13-story building that is proposed. And I may have it flipped. The 17-story building may be on the site of the row houses.
Yes, yeah.
And the
Yeah.
13 on the, but the point is, if you look at the existing neighborhood, with the possible exception of like 790 and 800, the buildings are for the most part, 5 or 6 story buildings. So if you're talking about preserving neighborhood character and scale, a 17-story building and a 13-story building is completely out of scale. It may work better on Broadway, but on 158th Street, which is fairly narrow, and on the Riverside Drive, that narrow part of the drive, those buildings are really out of character. So what we said 10 years ago and are saying again now to the Department of City Planning is the existing zoning should be changed so that any new development would have to be contextual. Contextual meaning there are height limits that are imposed so that you're not shrink wrapping. You're not saying that a new building can't be a story or 2 taller, but it can't be dramatically different. And the mission that was given to the Land Use Committee is I did some initial research, pulled from our reference materials some of the contextual zoning districts that I thought might be appropriate. Although Jim is absolutely right, the R8X, there's some contextual districts that allow for building heights that would not be appropriate in this section. And once again, if they're on Broadway, that might be different. If there are parts of Fort Washington closer to the hospital, it might be different. And so in this stretch from 155th to 177th, it may not be a single zoning district proposed. It may be a number of them based upon matching the existing built form and what's appropriate, in the lower part versus in the middle versus further up closer, to the bridge. So that's what we're talking about now. We're talking about, what do we think are, alternative zoning districts that the community board can propose to Department of City Planning as the template for them to use for a rezoning action. Vivian.
Yeah, I wondered, I know we're talking about the future, but if we were to look at something as being R, or want to change it to R8B, the older row houses, would that go faster if we're within the family of R8 rather than going to some version of R7? Or is
No,
it relevant?
that's not relevant because it's a zoning action, and whether you're doing it within the R8 or you're doing something completely different, it's the same legal process. It's the same, like, it's not ULURP per se, although it may be ULURP, it's the same regulatory process.
My other question, and then I'll let you go, is the question of wide streets. And if we were to try to rezone, it's an 1851 house, 857 Riverside, because of the whole idea of that strip median between the two sides of Riverside Drive, would that end up being considered a wide street for that reason and therefore not fall into narrow street categories?
That's an excellent question, for, perhaps for Olivia, but my point is, if that's our concern, then we might suggest, we could even suggest in, a resolution that if it's considered a narrow street, then we want contextual zoning district X. And if it's considered a wide street, we want contextual zoning, district, Y. Basically, focusing on, what is the maximum building height that we think is appropriate. And depending upon how the city of New York, and apparently the Parks Department and DOT and city planning don't agree on whether it's a wide street or a narrow street. But, that aside, the focus is, how tall do we think a new building should be? And whichever zoning district or districts plural meet that criteria is what we want city planning to consider. I see Steve and Tanya again.
Yes, I have 2 points. Number one, with respect to the R7B, although it may have been geared towards narrow streets, the zoning handbook says that it's often but not exclusively mapped along narrow streets.
Are you talking about R7B or R8B?
7B.
R7B, okay.
Isn't this the one that's geared towards neighborhoods with row houses? Oh, no, it's not. All right.
R8B.
Yeah, I'm sorry. It's 8B.
Or R8B, yeah.
And again, the language is that these districts are often but not exclusively mapped along narrow streets.
Yeah, I would suggest that we perhaps pay less attention to the narrative of where they say it's mapped.
Yeah.
And in the chart where it says the maximum base height and the maximum building height, I think that's more telling. Because where it's typically mapped is fine, but what it allows is the critical thing.
All right, but I'm just in response to what the point Vivian raised, as legitimate as it is, I'm not sure that the strip in between the upper and lower drives is going to should be a controlling factor. But my other point, though, is there is a development site on Broadway, now that I think of it, the hospital site between 169th and 170th Streets. So where they plan to put up a 13-story building. So I'm wondering whether we have the opportunity to rezone that block. Olivia, would you know whether or not the hospital has already filed plans for that block? Are we too late to do anything there?
Yeah, I can look into that, Steve. I'm not sure if they've filed yet, but let me take a look.
Right. But I also think, one of the things that was pointed out in, the planning study is, Broadway and Amsterdam, and even parts of St. Nicholas can better accommodate, taller or denser development than, the side streets or some of the smaller avenues. So, unless you're trying to, stick it to Columbia by saying we want to rezone their site. But the other thing that you have to remember is Columbia or any institution can probably advocate for, a site to be carved out of a rezoning, particularly if there is a planned development. And we know full well that there's a planned development because we've had presentations on the proposed, project, over several years.
Well, I would argue that the 13-story building is out of scale with everything else around it.
On Broadway,
On,
by the
well,
hospital?
on 170th Street, on the other side of Broadway or St. Nicholas Avenue, it would tower over Woodrow Court, and it would be twice as big as everything else on the 169th, 170th Street blocks.
Right, but as I said, Olivia can, look into that and get back to us on the process. Tanya?
Yeah, I was just looking at, Graham had a question about, maybe Graham can ask his question. It's up to you, Wayne, whether you want to let him ask it live or not, but about
Typically, I want to go through the committee members first and then.
Oh, sure. Oh, okay.
So
No
it's
problem.
like, what are your questions?
Probably one of the questions is the question he wants to ask. So that's one of my questions.
Well, then, since it's one of the questions you want to ask, why don't you state it?
Well, if so, yeah, I guess I'm just looking at what Graham wrote here. Just and I think this is something it definitely came up when we were talking about this before, but maybe for the purposes of explaining further of why not extend, the contextual zoning, continue it from up to Dykeman Street, 175th, mentioning that the Hilltop Pharmacy building on 187th and Fort Washington is for sale, and the zoning is R72, which is not contextual. So I just, is there a possibility of taking this idea and extending it beyond the areas that we've mentioned?
Well,
already?
so one of the things to remember, and this goes back a couple of years, more than a couple of years, when we first thought we had city planning's attention for rezoning. Washington Heights and Inwood is geographically a large area, and it can't all be done at once. So back then, literally the day after the rezoning of CB9 was approved, our city planning started conversations with us, and one of the things they asked us to do was to identify the area where we wanted them to start. And we did that. And I believe the area that we identified was between like 181st and Dykeman. And the reason why that was picked, because at that time in that area, there had been at least 3 development proposals, all of which seeking BSA, waivers to build buildings that were 2 or in some cases 3 times the as of right size. So there was a lot of development pressure in that area. City planning, they asked, for our opinion. They did not, however, begin in that area. And I think a lot of it is a function of when Councilman Rodriguez, focused on the area that was initially east of 10th Avenue in Inwood. The focus, then went to what the councilman wanted, and that grew into the bigger Inwood rezoning. Here, what we're saying is we have asked for the better part of a decade for the one area in Washington Heights that's R8. And if you think R72 is problematic, which it really isn't, R72 is a medium, density, and a lot of our buildings technically are denser than R72, and we couldn't build some of the buildings, like the building I live in, we could not build as of right today because it's too dense. But what we want city planning to focus on is this R8 area and rezone it to something that is more appropriate. That does not mean we cannot have concurrent planning discussions to look at other areas of Washington Heights and Inwood where rezoning actions would be appropriate. But my point is, we're finally getting some traction on something we've been asking for the better part of a decade, which is annoying. So let's not dilute it and lose focus. On the other hand, I did point out we did a planning study, and that planning study looked at the entire district, from 155th Street until you fall off of the island of Manhattan. So there's nothing that prevents us from having, on a monthly basis in land use discussions of other sections of the community and, talking exactly what we're doing now, saying what's the existing zoning, what are some of the issues, and what might be suggestions for zoning designations that would be more appropriate. As a matter of fact, it would be something I think we would all welcome, because far too often, and I said this, and I think a couple others said it, last month, residents can be very, reactionary. If there is a project that comes up that they find problematic, suddenly they're engaged. But it's probably, better or more effective to be more proactive, looking at what is it that you want, and having a track record of having, articulated that and working towards that. So that, it took forever, but, when the community board passed the resolution, January, telling city planning, listen, we've looked at this, we've suggested this. I guess you thought it really, wasn't an issue, that this type of development wouldn't happen. Here are two real examples of projects that are happening that could not have happened if you acted on our suggestions. And they finally said, okay, give us some suggestions, tell us what you would like. So we can identify other areas of Washington Heights and Inwood that may be problematic. But similarly, we might say there are certain areas where if we want to accommodate new development, maybe there are some areas where R72, is a little light in density. And if you're near a train station, if you're on a wide avenue, maybe you can take some more density. These are the kind of conversations that we would love to have on an ongoing basis. Steve?
Yeah, I would agree that we should be open to looking at the rest of the community as well. And let me tell you, what also comes to mind is the experience we had some years ago dealing with the quadriad proposal, and the fact that this guy came along and said he could put up the 35, 40-story buildings on Broadway at 193rd Fairview Avenue, including the Ortiz, was it the Ortiz Funeral Home site? And I think we need to take a look at that as well, because
But that was one of those BSA applications that led us to identify that area as the area that we wanted city planning to focus on.
right. But let's not lose sight of that, because someone else could come along and also decide to put up something on that site, even though somebody's building on the east side of Broadway. That funeral home site could still be available.
Right, but remember what you're saying, Steve.
Yeah.
The quadriad proposal was not an as of right proposal.
Yeah, yes, I know.
The two developments that we're talking about
Right.
are as of right,
Right, yes.
because that is what the zoning permits and encourages. Quadriad had a concept
Yeah.
of, how we could, use zoning to leverage affordable housing, because, in terms of the city budget at that time, maybe not so much,
Right.
but probably the capital that was being allocated to, affordable housing was on the decrease, as were, the low income tax credits. So it's like, if you could use density, but the point is those projects were in no way
Right.
permissible as maybe in the Times Square district, you could build
Okay.
buildings of that density.
Yeah, I understand that, but he still highlighted a potential site for significant,
For a project,
for
but
significant development, yes. So,
Yeah.
and there are other similar, there's a supermarket on Broadway and what is it, 87th Street or so? There are other sites along Broadway that are vulnerable that we should,
well, yeah, and some of those sites might in fact be, great sites for new development. It might be better to, instead of having a one-story supermarket, to have an 8 or 10-story apartment building with a supermarket on the ground floor. There's a difference between saying we want, appropriately scaled development versus, well, we don't want any new development at all.
no, I'm not saying that. I'm saying let's take a look at what the zoning permits now to make sure that potential development on those sites doesn't lead to something that,
Yeah, and that's kind of what I said. I think it would be great if we had, these ongoing discussions where folks would take the lead and look at different areas
Right.
of the community and identify sort of the pros and cons and, what, we might suggest in terms of solutions to what could be potential issues or solutions to what are potential opportunities.
all right, well, we have an agreement to look at them. Very good.
Jim?
I want to reinforce what Steve just said, and I think the most egregious example of R72 not serving this community well is the monstrosity that's going to be built at Sherman Avenue and Broadway that will ruin the view from the park. Had that been contextual at the time, and not R72, they would have been forced to have height limits and not build such a monstrosity. So again, we should, and again, I agree that we can't, redo all of Washington Heights at once. But the point is, there are all these places, and the example in many cases is what we saw at Sherman Avenue. This was a 2-story building that took up a lot of land, and now they're just building this monstrosity. They could do the same thing as pointed out where the Key Food supermarket currently is, and they could do the same thing with where the Hilltop Pharmacy is, which is the new issue. They could build a building. Well, again, and all of this is because it's R72. And if you want to, as has been explained, you can fiddle with things. So if you make the building narrower to get the same number of square feet, you can then go up much higher and provide nice penthouses for rich people to pay lots of maintenance for or rent.
That'll be you and Steve.
Well, I already have
You already have your penthouse, so you don't care, is what you're saying.
No, I don't live in a penthouse. No, I only live on the 11th floor.
Only on the 11th floor.
Only on the, but it's on a 200-foot cliff, so it's not too bad.
Yeah, okay.
But
Is that an old hand or a new hand, Tanya?
That's a new one. Tell me if I'm still on topic. I wanted to find out about with city planning, because when we get training in this, right? We get, as board members, we have an opportunity to take, to learn about zoning and what that means. And I was just wondering, because community is absolutely affected by this, if there was a possibility of similar trainings for community members can take themselves, right? That where they can learn about this different zoning and implications of that. Because I think there are people on this call, and I know recognize some of them that are more familiar and more educated about this, right? And have more experience. And then there are others that I feel probably not necessarily on this call, but there are others in the community that might be really disconnected from understanding.
There are others on the board who may be disconnected.
Right, that too. That absolutely is true, and that's real. And who may need more, who may be missing opportunities to really understand this in a deeper way, and it can be impacting them in a great way. So I was just wondering, maybe Wayne or something you can ask, or with DC with city planning, whether they that's something that could be done, or if that's something that could be included, added on to the inward rezoning, that there's education done
So-
as part of that?
I'll jump in really quick, Tanya. I
Okay.
mean,
All right, thank you.
Wayne has requested, and in the 4 or 5 meetings I've attended, I think on the very first time I met you all, Wayne, you did request a land use and building department zoning 101 training. So why don't we look for maybe next month or the following month? We can schedule that. I think that would be useful for members who aren't as familiar with the jargon. We can definitely look into that.
Yeah,
And I'd
for
be happy
community
to provide
people?
that.
so-
Yeah, absolutely. If
Yeah, Tanya, we have, in the context of the land use committee, on occasion, we've dedicated the entire committee meeting to the land use 101 training. And I actually have the PowerPoint presentation that was used when Scott Stringer, was, borough president. It's basically the same zoning information. It was updated, and I don't have the advanced PowerPoint, but maybe city planning does. And I know that there is a recording of one of those trainings, but it's not great because it's like if you're in the room and someone's recording from the back, so it's not as if it's a PowerPoint that's recorded and you can see it. But I did request if we could have not, in the context of the community board member training, but in the context of a committee meeting, the training. So that would be an agenda item, and the committee meetings are open to the public. Next month may not be great because, there are a couple of things that are on it. We do not typically meet in July, although sometimes we have. But that might be a good time to have a meeting that's dedicated just to training. Because otherwise we would not be, calendaring any agenda items for action. So that might be good to say that we'll hold a July meeting for training.
Great idea.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, knowledge is power. I just, I think a informed community can do more and be more engaged when they know and they understand the issues and understand factually, what's going on. And I just think it's just, to everybody's benefit. So thank you for, trying to facilitate that.
And
Yeah,
just
so
to
they
that point, the materials that were shared with all of you as committee members, I asked the office to put on CB12's website and have a link, because they're too big to email. So it's on the website. I think they named it New York City zoning. I suggested they rename it to zoning rest material, but the documents for everyone was on it that Steve Simon was referring to, stuff that I'm talking about, the documents that the board had last month that we're looking at, you have access to because they're on the community board's website. And for that matter, the planning study that I referenced, the planning study in its entirety, is available on the community board's website. So, there are sections in there that talk about affordable housing, they talk about contextual zoning. One of the interesting things that came out of that planning study, in 2007 or so, is that the earned income tax credit was actually of greater economic benefit to the community members than, some of the affordable housing programs that a lot of people didn't know about the earned income tax credit. So there's, it was more than, just, zoning that came out of that, planning study. But Olivia, if you can, let us know if it's, if you can confirm if we just kept the same date, but the third, Wednesday in July, as long as that's not the 4th of July, but if we could, confirm a date for July dedicated to, sort of the, zoning 101, that would be great. We could almost treat it like, a sort of a public forum.
yeah, sure. We'll look into the July date.
I see a couple of hands. I see Allegra and Stephen. Allegra being my sister, who is about to turn a birthday. I won't say how old she is. So Allegra.
Oh, hi, Wayne. Thanks a lot. I had thought.
And you're not the same Allegra, by the way, so just so there's no confusion.
Hi. Dr. Allegra Legrand, not Wayne's sister, but interested in what Chalkbeat reported this week about a very interesting pilot program in the Bronx where they went into the Laboratory School of Finance and Technology, and they developed a whole curricula for high school students such that they could fully participate in land use and land change discussions in their community. And this is part and parcel with what Tanya just brought up about it being a little bit impregnable to get through all the jargon. I don't think that the jargon is particularly useful. And although we think we're explaining, we're still saying R7A, R7B, FAR. I think that these things make it so that you have to go to like 10 meetings before you can fully participate in the discussion. If we're going to use jargon and this institutional knowledge, we should have a cheat sheet. That's what I do when I submit proposals. I can explain like really sophisticated climate change projections without invoking like Claudius Clapeyron. Y'all can explain land use and land change suggestions without using random acronyms. And I think that we should have those as a matter of course, as an introductory piece. Also, he originally come here to talk about, the plan changes along the waterfront, the park changes, and I didn't get the updated message about that not happening this month. But I would hope that this particular issue, which is of real interest to the broader Inwood, Washington Heights community, would have a lot of lead up so that plenty of people from the community could fully participate. I dropped into the questions Q&A the relevant folks from the Chalkbeat article that perhaps could be invited to facilitate discussion of an education on New York City proprietary land use, Euler process things. Thanks.
Great. And actually, going back to Tanya's suggestion, one of the things that the Land Use 101 training does is, as I say, break down, what not the jargon, what the terminology means, so that, folks understand that. And I think it is important for us, board members and community members, to understand, what the terminology means. Because in many cases there is misunderstanding, and in some cases, understanding what the terminology means actually allows us collectively to ask much more, insightful questions. I mean, we can say, well, if you were able to do XYZ with that zoning in a project there, why can't you do it here? But the training does that, but also going back to the materials that I referenced, one of the reference materials that's in the link is in fact the zoning handbook. And in the zoning handbook, there's a whole section that, just defines all of these terms. And Allegra, it's actually not just, lay people who have issue with it. Experienced architects, will at times have trouble trying to make sense of the building code and the zoning resolution and, what all the intricacies, mean. So, you're absolutely right. There is a need for folks to be able to understand what it is we're talking about. But I think it's equally important to not say, well, it's too complicated for folks to understand what floor area ratio means, because it's not. At the end of the day, it's just math. And once you understand, what the terminology means, then it's easier to follow along. At least that's my 2 cents. Stephen.
Well, first of all, I just want to check, can you hear me?
Yes.
Fabulous. I want to thank the community board for your expertise and including your residents as part of this meeting.
It's a public meeting. It's an open meeting. we love people to participate and share and feel a little neglected when you don't.
Well, I hope you feel the love because that's what I'm expressing. I live nearby the residence that you referred to as the wood frame house on Riverside Drive. And you're questioning whether or not it's a small street or a non-small street. I don't know the strict definitions of such streets, but I will share with you. So it's a one-lane street going in both directions.
I live near you.
Oh, we're neighbors. It also includes the bus route. So these huge double buses go through the street. It's like a small community street because people double park when they need to drop off their deliveries after they went shopping. So the street frequently is what I'll call occluded, especially when the bus is there and somebody is double parked to drop off their shopping and the bus is there trying to get around the double parking. So I wouldn't call it a small street. I would call it an extremely small street. And I think that's why the height of any new building needs to be restricted based on what you are contemplating as the new zoning. So I just wanted to include that. I'm sure it sounds to me, Benjamin, that you're already aware of this if you're my neighbor, but I think Steve was struggling whether or not it was a small street or not small street. Based on the reality of what that street entails, it is clearly a small street.
Yeah, and Steve actually doesn't live that far from, the location either. It's not that he was struggling with it. What I pointed out is the city agencies don't agree. And an example is when Gail Brewer was borough president, she and I think all of the elected officials who represent the area wrote a letter to the building department. I believe they also copied the Commission of DOT, expressing the concerns that we and community members had with the proposed development, one of which was the street. From DOT's perspective, when we have a traffic and transportation committee, as you said, the street is so narrow and busy that consideration was given to making it one way. On the other hand, I think from the building department's perspective, they don't consider the parkland that's between the upper and lower drives to be a park. They can just consider it to be a median, no different than like the medians on like Broadway or Park Avenue. I think once you get above 162nd or 163rd Street, then they consider it a park. Why the difference, I don't know. And since they only consider it a median, they're looking at the width to be from one side of Riverside Drive all the way to the other side. So DOT and the building department don't agree on the definition of what it is. And city planning and the borough president's office, when we looked into that, that's going back to my point where, looking at the building code and the zoning resolution, there are all of these complications that no one can give a straight answer. So I just want to clarify, it's not that Steve was struggling with it. He was probably articulating the fact that based upon our experience, depending on which city agency you speak to, you're going to get a different answer as to whether it is a wide street or a narrow street.
Well, thanks for defending Steve, but
That was not my intention.
I know. But clearly anybody who lives in this area realizes that median is not in any way effective. It's a great median. I mean, it's beautiful, but it doesn't differentiate the size of the actual roadway. The upper roadway, it has nothing to do with the lower roadway.
And that is exactly the point that was made, in the letter that was drafted more than a year ago.
Thank you.
Steve, are you following up on that comment?
Yeah, I'd like to be able to defend myself.
Oh, Lord.
So I also live in that immediate neighborhood, and I'm quite familiar with the inner drive and how narrow it is. And what I was trying to say earlier, and apparently not effectively, is that if we were to try to rezone it as a contextual district, we should not focus on that particular issue about whether the street is narrow or not, whether or not the median is considered to be part of the street or not. Because as I read the zoning handbook, the contextual district, this R8B, would apply whether the street is narrow or not. So
Yeah, and that's one of the points that I made. Don't focus on
Right.
that. Focus on what is the maximum height that is allowed, because that at
Right.
the end of the day
So-
is what will govern.
Right, so I think we could continue to advocate that it be rezoned as a contextual district, regardless of the width of the street.
Absolutely. Thanks, Steve. Maggie?
Hi there. Yeah, I haven't been here for a while. So I spent 5 years of my life fighting the new development at Sherman and Broadway, and then the general Inwood rezoning. I'm a PhD environmental scientist. I've taught environmental impact statements at the corporate level, and I really want everybody to understand that it's not a given that we have to have more population in New York City or in Manhattan. And doing so actually causes the city to be in further contravention of the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act. You know that of course tall buildings cause a lot of problems, but adding population and cars and toilet flushes and so forth also cause problems. And I don't know that people consider that as much. And I just wanted to bring it up. Traffic, in addition, you can't ameliorate that. If you add, 50 new cars to an immediate area, eventually ambulances won't be able to get to the hospital before the people in them die. My mother died in an ambulance going to the Allen. So it's a particularly important point. And just adding more population, you can't. Okay, let me just give you an example. The EIS for the Inwood rezoning, the traffic chapter, was very clear. They measured traffic in a number of ways. A couple of them, one of them was they give every intersection a letter grade. A is great, E is full at capacity, F is like worse than that. And so they said that Inwood before the rezoning ranged, by my eyeball from B through D, most of the intersections. And after the rezoning, and that's not R8 rezoning, by the way.
No, it's not.
And the after scenario is most of the intersections would be F, with some of them being E. And that is a monstrous, awful thing to consider, that, all the intersections would be that way, but it's not hard to understand why that would be the case. I can count something like 6 buildings in the immediate area that are going to be, close to 20 feet up to 30 feet. And all those additional people and all those additional cars. And that's not everything that the developers want to do here. Those are just the first few. And, you give them an inch, they will take 20 miles. And the environment suffers. The environment doesn't have a voice, except for a few of us. If you cause damage to somebody's property, then they're going to speak up, but the environment can't speak up. So I hope that we don't consider that we have to just accept some development. Also, MIH is not affordable housing anyway, so.
Yeah, and it's an interesting point. It's, sometimes we focus on, what it is developers are proposing. But in some of our conversations, when projects are presented to us, or in some cases in our conversations with city planning, it's less what the developers are proposing and more so what City Hall is advocating for. And, that's one of the reasons why, the community board has pointed out in various resolutions that, we have a certain, vision for, how to maintain neighborhood scale and character. And, that really should be, considered, and not just, if, the former mayor, wanted to say that he developed, X 100,000 units of affordable housing, and he's going to do that in certain targeted neighborhood. And so he's going to do that by, upzoning. It was really just a function of what was the objective of City Hall, not what was good neighborhood planning.
Yeah, I get that. I fully understand that, but I guess what I am saying is that I hope that the community board, our voice, can be a bit louder and more pointed, in terms of the environmental impacts, the impacts to society of doing this. And that, if they're looking for affordable housing, well, they need to keep the rents down, this conversions to market, the bleeding of the housing, the rent stabilized housing. Every time somebody moves out and they wreck the place and put in all new stuff and raise the rent, and now your market. That's been happening for decades.
Yeah.
And that's not good for affordable housing.
No, not at all. Thank you, Maggie.
Okay.
Is it Kalitha? Kalitha? Macaulay?
Keltha.
Kaltha, I'm sorry.
No, nobody gets it right. It's fine. I've liked what a lot of the other people have said, and what Maggie Clark says as well. I personally don't think we need any more people, but then who am I to say you can't come to New York? And I know that a beautiful empty park does not bring in the tax revenue of a building. So I don't know how we get around that. I do have a couple of questions though. I came in about a half hour late, so it was like 7:30. And I also agree that we definitely need that handbook you talked about. Where can I get a zoning handbook? So I'll just know.
It's available online.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, and you can just, Google the New York City zoning handbook and download it. Or if you go to CB12's website, I think it's now under a section called New York City zoning. There's a link to the handbook.
Perfect. I will do that. But my question was, and I actually wrote it incorrectly. What is the existing zoning for height on Washington Avenue and Fort Washington Avenue and 187th above the, what is it, the Hilltop Pharmacy? Because I know that's a 1-story now.
Right. And as I explained earlier, the zoning that's currently in place, the zoning that was put in place in 1961, when I was a mere baby, there are no height limits. There are density limits, but as Jim said, if you could have, for example, a building that covers the maximum that's allowed. So I think typically you can cover 70% of your site. And if that allows you to go up, 4 stories, that's it. You can take the same building, and instead of covering 70% of the site, if you cover 35% of the site, your 4-story building is an 8-story building. If so, it's called height factor zoning, and that's one of the things you can look up in the book. As long as you do not break an imaginary line, it's just like an angle that is supposed to allow light to come into the street. As long as you don't break that, you can go as high as you want. There are certain practical limits because as you start setting back, the floors get smaller, and there's some economic considerations of building really small floors and having elevators serving them. But the thing that people often confuse is just because the existing buildings in the community are of a certain height, it does not mean that height was required by zoning. That's just happens to be the height of the buildings. Most of our buildings were probably built, before the 1950s.
Oh, yeah.
I live in a building that was built, before New York City had zoning. So I mean, it was from 1911. So there are a lot of buildings in the community that are, pretty old, and the height is not a function of what is allowed based on the 1961 zoning.
So I'm a little concerned because we are also a neighborhood where the buildings are older and they're all stone and brick and things. And I know that this is going to be some glass hideousness, just because that's what they build now. But the other thing is, if you look at 57th or 58th Street and those tiny, skinny little buildings that are going up taller than anything else, and you've got a view from the, I don't know, 60th floor or something. And they're pencil buildings. And could that possibly happen here? What do you think is the probability of?
Though, if you would look at the map, that's a very different zoning. And that was the point I was making when Steve was talking about a proposal from years ago that required any number of changes to zoning and variances, but you could not build that project as of right anywhere uptown, or for that matter, on the Upper West Side. I think in the Times Square district, in some areas and sort of west of that, I think that's like an R10 to get the kind of height and density they were talking about.
Okay, also, can we possibly get more under, I don't even own a car, but it is a problem for parking and things. Is it possible to get new buildings to have underground garages built?
Once again, based upon the zoning, and the different zoning categories, certain percentage of parking is required. It's never 100%. So if you have a 50-unit building, typically you don't have to provide 50 parking spaces. But once again, there are competing planning objectives, and we're getting a little bit too much into this, and we don't have that much time left in the meeting. But I just want to point out that in some cases, the planning goal is to reduce cars and parking. So developments that are near transit, in many instances, the parking requirement is reduced or waived. For affordable housing, in many instances, the parking requirements are reduced or waived. So for market rate developments, the parking is required by zoning. Or if you're in an area where there's a clear demand for, interior, parking, because that's not going to be free, you have to pay for it. And as someone pointing out, paying for parking in Manhattan is like paying rent. Then that is a possibility, but just be mindful that in many instances, asking for more parking is going against planning, initiatives that are seeking to reduce cars and, reduce parking and focus more on public transit. So you get into the balancing of competing, objectives.
No, I understand. And the very last thing is, how much influence does this community board have?
Any community board is an advisory board. But the point is, we have to leverage our relationships with our elected officials, because our elected officials are the one, for example, if it is any of these discretionary actions, it has to go through the borough president and the city council. And for example, when Gail Brewer was borough president, the first thing she would ask is, what did the community board say? And the current borough president, Mark Levine, is a former member of this board. But any community board in the city of New York, and I think there are 59 of them, they're advisory. The city agencies or the mayor's office don't have to listen. The question is, how do you leverage relationships to, make them listen? And, and that's one of the reasons why I say it's important for us to understand the terminology, because the extent to which one makes recommendations and it appears you don't know what you're talking about, you don't understand how it is, it's like, okay, well, we got what you said, but you really don't understand. Whereas if it's clear that you do understand, and what you're saying is what is being proposed is, not good neighborhood planning, and here are the reasons why, that's something else. But let me move on.
Thank you.
You're quite welcome. Carla. Carl, I think you can unmute yourself.
Okay, there I am.
Oh,
Sorry about that. Hi, Wayne. Hi, everybody. Good to see you. My name's Carla Fisk. I'm a member of Northern Manhattan is Not for Sale and Inwood Legal Action, and was very active in challenging the rezoning of Inwood. Anyway, my question about, I've got a number of questions around this, because the first is, committee, land use committee, are you going to be proposing contextual rezoning for all of these properties that you've mentioned? Or have you already proposed contextual rezoning? And three-part question. And have you already spoken with Borough President Levine, council members De La Rosa and Abreu? And my third question is Abreu, thank you, Abreu. How can the community support Community Board 12 in this? Because I think it's a really smart idea. I think a lot of people would like to actively support this. And I'm eager
I'll begin where you ended. I mean, one of the great ways to, support what we're doing is to be active participants. You don't have to be, I think, as you know, Carla, you don't have to be a member of the committee to participate in the committee meetings. And as a matter of fact, like Vivian is what's called a public member. So she's not a member of the Community Board per se, although she used to be, but she's just a member of the Land Use Committee. And so if there was someone who was just interested in being active, because community members also are voting members of the Land Use Committee. So, but basically, Land Use meets the first Wednesday of the month, every month except for July and August. So one way to support is to, tune in, participate, and the extent to which we're doing things and we ask for assistance in getting the word out, help us to get the word out. We actually had a meeting with Councilwoman De La Rosa, I think 2 months ago. We talked about our planning initiatives, our planning priorities and hers. We've mentioned to Borough President Levine a couple times during general board meetings, some of these things. We have not proposed anything yet. The purpose of this meeting was to have my fellow committee members, share their thoughts on, some of the options for, rezoning. And coming out of this, I don't think we'll have a resolution per se. I think it will be, something where we've narrowed it to, a few choices. And then it'll be great to have a broader, conversation on what those choices, look like and, how to proceed. And there again, that will be an excellent, opportunity to have, a broader community discussion on, understanding what those options are, what they might look like, and, how to move forward with them.
Thanks, Wayne.
You're welcome. Stephen Jones. Steve Jones. Steve? Okay, maybe I'll come back to Steve. And instead go to Catherine O'Sullivan.
Hi there, good evening, everybody. Very interesting discussions. One thing, as I put in the Q&A, is that this decision by whoever on Community Board 12 to sort of hide the list of attendees is very off-putting. But
there's no, I think we've discussed this before, so let me stop you right there. There's no decision made by the Community Board to hide anything. That's the way the Zoom platform works.
Well,
we don't control that.
Okay. At meetings I'm at, I can always see who I'm in the meeting with. But however, that's not for, that's not why I'm here tonight. That's just an observation that makes me unhappy.
Yeah, well, let me just stop you once again. I understand what you're saying, because at work, when we have meetings, and it depends on how the meeting is set up. So this is set up so that the committee members and panelists are set up as panelists, and then everyone else is set up as an attendee. And who can see what is the function of how you're set up. But
Okay.
anyway, you're
Yeah, well, I just
comment
wanted to
about
say,
this.
I'm pleased to hear that, you're all seem to be quite concerned with increased density and too much density. I just want to sort of say that many residents really wanted the R7A extended down to the southern section of Inwood, and had we listened to by the Department of City Plotting, or Planning as some people call it, we all know that they're totally in bed with the real estate industry. However, I mean, if we had gotten the R7A zoning then, we wouldn't be dealing with the ugly thing going up where the very handsome Packard building used to be. So that's just my observation. And anything you can do, even if it's only in an advisory capacity, it will be welcomed by the community to curb excessive height and density. Yeah, I mean, really, there are plenty of vacant lots and small one-level buildings around the city. In-building is a good idea, but all these super tall towers, they're all empty and vacant, and they're not doing anything for our housing. Thank you.
You're welcome. Graham.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you, Wayne, and thank you to the committee for raising this issue and taking it on. So it's much appreciated. What I wanted to ask is, would the Land Use Committee be willing to host a public hearing so that community members could say directly to our council members and borough president and anybody else who you feel has a big say in this, exactly how important this is? Because I feel we need to generate some, it's great that you brought people together today, but we need to generate some momentum. And I think that's, something that we, community members and the committee can really work on together.
Yeah, well, that's kind of one of the things I suggested that might be the next step after we've identified, what the committee sees as, some good alternatives to the R8, is to then have a, broader discussion, a broader public discussion about that. And, doing it in the context of a public, or, a public meeting, or just, a committee meeting where that's the only agenda item that we're talking about, and to have, our city council reps and our borough president and DCP, invited and confirmed, would be key and critical.
Sounds good. Thank you.
You're welcome. Rochelle. Rochelle?
Go ahead. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, hi. A few days ago, I submitted through Chanel comments of Professor Klaus, what's his name exactly, Professor Klaus Jacob, to your attention. I wonder if they reached you, if you had a chance to read them, and what your thoughts are.
Yes, the email was received. No, frankly, I have not had the opportunity yet to go through it in detail, although I'm pretty certain that I was present when it was presented originally several years ago. I believe I forwarded that to the committee members, and if I did not, I will, but this was the sort of the geotech report that was referenced at last month's meeting.
Wayne, I have not seen it. I would like to have it.
Okay, well, as I said, if I have not forwarded, I will. But I'm also pretty certain that, Steve, you were on the committee when it was originally presented back when Ruddy Thompson was talking about it, because it's the same report.
I know, but that's a number of years ago. I'd like to be refreshed.
Well, that's why I said I will send it. Thank you, Rochelle.
Well, I still am not quite clear whether they are going to reach your attention or not.
No, I did receive it, yes.
Right. Did you read it? I'm sorry.
I just said I did receive it. I have not yet had the opportunity to go through the geotechnical report, and I will share the report with my fellow land use committee members, because it's not just me who should be, having the pleasure of reading through a geotechnical report.
Okay, thank you. And when are we going to know about what your thoughts are?
We will, probably have some additional comments at our next land use committee meeting.
Okay, and the public is going to know about that.
As I said, the land use committee meets the first Wednesday of every month, except for July and August at 7 o'clock. And we've been meeting the first Wednesday of every month at 7 o'clock for at least a dozen years.
Okay, thank you.
You're quite welcome. Dave.
Can people hear me?
Yes.
Hi, Wayne, and hello to the committee, and thank you for organizing this interesting discussion. I have just one comment to make and a question to ask, procedural question. The comment is just following up on Graham's suggestion that we have a community meeting, which I completely agree with. I totally get what you said, Wayne, that we should schedule a community meeting after the cognoscenti have narrowed the choices down to a few possible choices that will meet the needs of the wider community. But I think before we do that, we have to know what the needs of the community are. And I think that people who live in the community should be consulted. And I think without their understanding the difference between R7 and R8, they can still say there's too damn much traffic, or we don't want our subway station to be more crowded, and we're concerned about the environmental impact of high rises and so on. And I think that kind of information will help the land use committee form an informed idea of what kind of zoning meets the desires of community people. So that's the opinion part. My question, because I'm ignorant about the technical aspects of this, is the following. After the committee decides, hopefully in consultation with the community, what the recommendations are and makes those recommendations to the city planning, or I just learned it's really called the city plotting committee, what is the procedure then? What steps is it a regular Euler procedure, or are there other steps? Who makes the actual decision? And how does the community put pressure on the city planning commission so that the needs of the community are met? Because I agree completely with Catherine that this commission is really in the pocket of developers, or at least a lot more responsive to developers than it is to grassroots community people, as witnessed by inward rezoning. Okay.
So Olivia, would you like to just briefly talk about what a typical rezoning process would entail? If you're still there, Olivia, I see your face. Well, let me, Dave, let me just, a rezoning, a rezoning action, would, require, an application that identifies the, the geographic area where the rezoning is going to take place, what the existing zoning is, what the proposed zoning is, and then there would have to be an environmental, impact statement for, how the proposed action. So if you are familiar with the steps that the formal steps that the Inwood, rezoning went through, that is what this or, any rezoning. The reality is an application can be submitted by, in the case of Community Board 9, the Borough President's Office took the lead on that. Scott Stringer took the lead on that rezoning. Private individuals or private property owners can submit, a rezoning, or for that matter, it could be an initiative of the Department of City Planning itself. So what the community board has asked city planning to do is for it to initiate a rezoning action to change the R8 to, something that would be contextual. And we're in the process of, giving them, some recommendations. We would not be averse if Mark Levine as borough president played a similar role that Scott Stringer did. And, he took the lead and said, okay, the borough president's office is going to submit the application. But, all of those are possibilities. And, being a neighborhood resident, and I think I live across the hall from you, we absolutely agree that it's important to get community input. And the interesting thing is a lot of what we're talking about now is a result of conversations with community residents on the proposed project at the 158th Street row houses. And we've been talking with folks about that for the last probably year and a half, if not more, as well as, speaking with community residents about the, 857 Riverside Drive. And it was a function of those discussions that, led to the letter being drafted, which Community Board 12 played a role in, where, Gail Brewer and others, wrote to the borough, the building department and others, articulating all of these concerns coming not just from the community board, but from community residents. Going back to some of the earlier conversations, we absolutely look forward to, community residents staying engaged with us so that we're getting, a sort of a full cross section of what the concerns are. And, yes, we can talk about, building height and density and traffic, and, but we do that on a monthly basis throughout, our, various committees. We're pushing 8:33. I see some committee member hands back up, so I'm going to switch back. And the order that I see it on my screen is Tanya. Well, actually, let me not do that. Sally is a board member, and I can remember, but Sally has not spoken yet. So let me go to Sally first.
Thank you, Wayne. I appreciate your commitment to a July meeting, and I just wanted to second my support for that being a public hearing rather than just a committee meeting. I think it's important that our elected officials listen to us at the beginning, not at the end when they've already made up their minds. And that's all I have to say. Okay.
Tanya?
Sorry, two things. One, I was just going to say that I think, as far as a simplified list of the process, and I know we got something like that in the training, because I remember, taking a screenshot, and I was trying to find it actually so people could screenshot it on the screen, but it says the process of what
we can
happens.
have it posted to the website.
Yeah, because I think that would be helpful so people know that, and perhaps you know, you remember school, everybody knows, well, people say not everybody, but Schoolhouse Rock, how we make things really simplified. Maybe there's a way to, you know, really have to create a pamphlet or something where it's a more very, very basic, you know, sort of explanation of these things would probably be good, because a lot of people learned how the process of government works through Schoolhouse Rock because it was very
Yeah.
simple.
Well,
And then the last, go ahead.
No, the document that I'm thinking of is a one pager. It takes
Yes.
the beginning to the end.
Yes, that's it.
And it's
That's
just very
it.
simplified.
That's it. That was the one I was looking for while we were they were talking. So yeah, that's it. And it was very helpful for me to understand the process. But the last thing I just wanted to say is about us. I really do strongly feel like you know, we should have a chat function when, especially when we have meetings like this, because if there are links that, you know, like when you refer to, Wayne, you know, specific documents, maybe the links could be posted, you know, in the chat so people can have instant access to it. And I'm not saying, you know, we should tell people, don't, you know, be lazy and don't try to look things up, but I'm just saying, like, it could be really helpful. People are in the meeting, that they can have the instant links and they can download them. And I just think, I don't know why the decision was made to disable the chat function in our meetings. I don't agree with that decision. I was not asked my opinion about that decision. So I'm going to make that very clear, that if it were up to me, we would not disable chat at all. But since we've been on Zoom, we've not allowed, I think we allowed it with first meeting or something, and then it was stopped. And so I just think it would be helpful for that, just for information. Like, we could put links and information in there so people could just download it, and it's just easier. So I just want to be clear that we, you know, chat is an option in Zoom, but we do not use it.
Yeah, but it's you know, it's not set up that way, and I don't set up the meetings.
Right. Be clear, you didn't do that.
And
right.
my recollection of why it was disabled, and, you know, Jim Berlin being the parliamentarian might refresh my memory, is what was happening, and in some cases it was happening almost intentionally, is we were having competing meetings going on at the same time. The chat was turning into a separate meeting, and you had a whole chain of conversation there. And that's not the purpose of having a chat function, you know, during a community board meeting. There's supposed to be one meeting, and, you know, after, you know, and in some cases it was members of the community board who were engaging and enabling sort of the competing meeting. And so that, I think, is the reason why the chat was, you know, disabled, because folks were not able to, you know, follow procedures.
We should
If
have
I
had
could
a vote.
amplify that, that's basically the situation as Wayne described it was, well, there are 2 points. Number one, when the community board has a meeting or a committee has a meeting, and this is how parliamentary procedure works, there's a meeting. There are not 2 meetings. And as Wayne pointed out, not only was the chat being used as this whole other meeting, but it was a whole meeting that was completely under control with obscenities and heaven only knows what. So most community boards, in fact, don't use the chat. Now, it turns out I believe panelists can do it too. You can actually post things in the Q&A. And so we've been using the Q&A to post the sort of things that Tanya is suggesting. And I think, you know, that is indeed very helpful.
Yeah, I think the hosts can do that.
Right.
Yes, only the hosts, not random folks who don't have host ability. So without host abilities, you can't post anything.
The chat's not supposed,
it's not supposed to be
with Wayne. There's no reason Wayne should not technically be the host, and therefore he could, use his auspices as host to post all these various things.
But anyway, it'll be hard for him to host. It'll be hard for him to host and post at the same time.
Yet, you're doing back and forth, if you don't mind. So the reason the chat was disabled is why, as I explained it, the odds are it will not be enabled. There are ways around it, and that's the story.
Can I say one more thing? And sorry for interrupting, Jim. But I wanted to say, yes, I do. I remember that because I remember the meeting, and there was one particular individual, who was engaging in obscenities. I'm not going to say who, but I know who they are, and they were engaging in that. It was horrible, and that person should just been removed from the meeting, and we could have gone on about our business. But I do remember that, and that was true. That happened. That can happen in any meeting setting where someone might, be abusing it. But and I do understand that there were. That's the point of chat. That's why it's called chat. So people could be sharing information. I think that one for.
Yeah, Tanya, we understand the concept.
But I'm just saying we need to have a vote. We should have voted. Like I don't.
But that is not a land use function.
But people have brought it up here.
I understand that. But also I think, and I also we've made at least I've made a great effort to making sure that the information that we're talking about is made publicly available. And I've stressed over and over again, including to board members who seem in some cases not to pay attention, that a lot of this information is available on the community board's website, because we made a point of making sure that the planning study and some of these other studies are all on the website. It means they're public information. They're readily accessible.
Wayne, I'm not going back and forth. I'm just going to say one last thing. I hear you. You are absolutely correct. I mean, you and I and other people can just go to do it. But I've been saying, like, it is hard to find some of that stuff. It is hard to you go and navigating around and you're trying to find things, and it's very difficult. I'm saying, as a board member looking for things, I can't find half the things I'm looking for. So, and I can only imagine somebody who's not on the board who is trying to navigate that. So I'm just saying, for us, only thing I was mentioning is this was for us, because we have so many complicated things or documents we're referring to, chat would just make it easier. Just drop that stuff in and people can just download it right away, right there, and they don't have to go searching for it. That's why I brought this up. And that's the purpose of my bringing this up.
We can certainly work on a solution.
That's what I'm saying.
Hi. What I wanted to, I know you're going to say it's not our district, or
it's not our district.
Don't be so predictable. Anyway, John Reddick was telling me about CB9, and over the years that they managed to rezone, I think around actually where he lives at 142nd, and that therefore a taller building actually couldn't be built. I'd love to hear from somebody from that group to hear about how they managed to do it through the community board.
Well, but
unless you know.
Well, I mean, it would be great to have that conversation, but I also pointed out that the borough president took the lead in advancing Community Board 9's rezoning. And we would, I'm sure, not object if the borough president took the lead in advancing Community Board 12's rezoning.
If he would.
Right, because remember, Community Board 9, and Steve has mentioned this over the years, Community Board 9 passed a very well-received 197A plan, and it was done, sort of, or the impetus of it was the Manhattanville project. The problem is 197A plans do not have the force of law. They're just, kind of advisory. Now, ideally, city government is supposed to take those plans and use them as a template for action, but they're not required to. So what Scott Stringer did is basically took the principles coming out of CB9's 197A plan and took the lead in a rezoning action. So the zoning is law. Zoning has the force of law. So, Scott Stringer could have, or Gail Brewer could have, or Mark Levy can take the principles that came out of our neighborhood planning study, or they can take the things we're talking about. They can advance a rezoning study. But I would also say the Community Board 9 has a very dedicated, organized, focused community of preservationists who work towards, on an ongoing basis, preservation issues and planning issues that pertain to preservation. And that is sometimes, but not always, the case with CB12. When I first came on the board, there wasn't a lot. Over the years, there's been a growing interest in, preservation, and, in some cases, realizing how preservation can help to, preserve neighborhood character, but in other cases, just recognizing the history that is around you every day that you don't even understand is there. And once people start to realize what's there, then they want to know what can be done so that history is acknowledged and recognized. But enough of that. So I think this has been a wonderful conversation. And do my committee members agree that, we should hold a July meeting as a public hearing to talk about these issues and the zoning training? Hello, speak.
Well, are you suggesting that we do the training at the same time as we do the public hearing? Because
well, we began by saying, we wanted to do the training and have the training open to the public.
Yes.
And we talked about asking city planning to do that.
Yes.
For July. So maybe we can't do both. Maybe we want to do the training first.
Yes.
And follow up with a separate, meeting, public hearing meeting after the training. But it would be, because quite frankly, the training itself is going to be a good, hour and a half, if not more.
Yes, and I would like to see the public hearing based on a concrete proposal that comes out of this committee, so that people have something to respond to. I mean, I think we're well aware of the environmental issues in our community, and the fact that we already live in a very dense area of the city, and which is already pretty well built to the limit. And I think we're in agreement on this committee, if not on the board, that we should try to adopt a contextual rezoning plan. We certainly have been talking about it for enough years. We should try to move forward. My preference would be to have the City Planning Commission initiate the rezoning. I suspect if they initiate it, we might have a greater chance of success. And but if that doesn't happen, I certainly would want to turn to the borough president and ask him to take it on.
Thank you, Steve. Let's see, Jim and Tanya. Jim, you're muted.
Sorry. My thinking is similar to Steve's, that we should have the training first. The other thing, and I don't know, it turns out land use is not quite the same, if Allegra is still with us, as some of the pursuits that she follows. And in fact, when we say R72, it's indeed a shortcut. It may be a jargon, but what it has behind it is basically 2 or 3 pages of text in the zoning handbook. And the idea of the training, because it turns out, although there's a lot of text, the concepts are not all that complicated, as Wayne has been explaining all night. When we have the training, when people will actually learn these terms of art, and they'll be able to use the shortcuts. So that's one piece. Now, the second misunderstanding I think some people may have is generally when the community board has a public hearing, it's because we're required to, because we have to review something, or as Steve pointed out, there's an actual proposal that we want information on. Now, the thing about the public hearing is the people holding the public hearing are the community board. And we will listen and do everything we're supposed to do with the public hearing, but we cannot require any elected official to attend the public hearing. If you want to have a public hearing with the other public officials on it, at it, they presumably have to hold their own hearing. I mean, we can invite them, but the reality is that when we hold public hearings, it's mainly so we get the community's input on a proposal that's before us, so that we, the community board or the committee, and then the community board can actually take the community's views into, our cognizance. And when we vote, we will have, all that information available to us. So I hope that was helpful as to what public hearings are all about.
Yeah, and we shouldn't get too too tied up in the sort of in the terminology, because yeah, a public hearing, particularly in the context of, you know, ULURP and BSA, is a certain thing. But community boards can have, you know, public meetings or public workshops or town hall meetings, call it what you will, that's dedicated to discussing a specific topic. And and Jim is absolutely right, you know, we cannot require the elected officials, but I don't see Carmen De La Rosa and, you know, John Abreu and Mark Levine saying, no, we don't want to, you know, I mean, assuming we coordinate with their schedules, that, you know, they don't want to join us in a conversation on a topic that is also very much one of their priorities. So the critical thing, and that's probably another reason to give us a little more time, is coordinate, you know, with our, you know, 3 key elected officials, the 2 council people, and, you know, the borough president. We have, you know, assembly and Senate reps who are, you know, also community residents who are supportive. But I think the critical thing, since this will be going through a city process, is to make sure that, you know, we are in dialogue with our, you know, 3 key city elected officials. If someone from the mayor's office, you know, wanted to be present, that would be nice. And years ago, we had greater, you know, level of participation from the mayor's office. And I think in some of our recent general meetings, there's been a rep, but it hasn't been all that consistent. Tanya.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I agree with everybody about the training coming first. I think that's great. And I think July is perfect. And I wanted to say before, I do think that before there's any type of proposal submitted or something from our committee, that that there is some engagement, like there is some sort of way to sort of gather information and data, information from the community in terms of what are some areas of concern for them in terms of zoning and their vision for their particular community areas, that we can take that and be a part of any kind of recommendations that we would have in regard to contextual zoning. So I just, you know, if there was a way to do something like that, and how we, you know, gather that information, is there a way? I mean, is that, you know, a public hearing of sort, or is it another way where it's something that can be done outside of that process? Because I understand what you're saying about public hearings, but is there a way that we can gather, speak to community people about this and gather some of their feedback before we, as a committee, you know, present something officially to say this is,
well, I mean, but that was my point, that coming out of this meeting was not going to be any kind of a resolution. It was, you know, kind of to hear and summarize, you know, what our thoughts are, because heretofore it's just been, you know, my thoughts. But, you know, what's interesting is I know that, you know, in some instances, city planning and EDC, they've put together sort of online surveys where they, you know, outline what the issue is, and, you know, what are they trying to do, and then people can put their comments in. So that might be an interesting thing to do, to take some of the materials and, you know, create, and, you know, the folks on our board who deal with the website can help us do this, you know, put together a specific section of the pay website that's talking about contextual zoning, and, you know, what are some of the options, what are some of the issues, and then have, you know, a survey component where you can then go in and, you know, put your comments in there, and it gets, you know, sent to a central spot, and we can periodically, you know, download that, or whatever the technical term is, because, you know, we can also use that as a means of further informing what we talk about at the eventual public hearing. But we could have spent a couple of weeks or a couple of months just people at their leisure going to the site, and we can have, the office do an e-blast with a link, so you don't have to go looking, Tanya, to that section of the site that says, Committee Board 12 is considering blah, 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 blah. And we're, in the future, we're going to have, public hearings to talk about it. But in the meantime, here's some reference information, and here's a survey or an opportunity. So that's something we could certainly, look at and work on.
That sounds good, Wayne. Thank you.
I think it was Steve, then Jim.
I just want to say that if we're going to have any impact on the two vulnerable sites on 158th Street and Riverside Drive, we really need to act sooner rather than later. The longer this process stretches out.
But Steve, we're already talking about, those two sites.
Yes.
Specifically with the projects, but beyond those two sites, it's also the rest of the area.
I understand that, but
so they can work in parallel.
Yes, but our initial, I think you pointed out, we were initially motivated by the issues with those two sites, and once plans are filed for those two sites, the existing zoning is locked in.
Well, what are you suggesting? Yeah, I mean, everything you're saying is true, but what are you suggesting?
I'm suggesting we need to come up with a proposal very quickly.
Well, no, but specifically for those two sites.
Yes, for those two sites.
I mean, what, because, you can't, do a proposal that kind of spot zones those two sites. The approach that we took that said that the developments are inappropriate for a number of reasons, and having the elected officials, push that, is in fact focusing on those two sites. What further, what more should be done to advance what we've already started with respect to expressing opposition to those two developments?
Well, I mean, I think the tack that we've taken up to now is to try to have them designated as landmarks or incorporated into historic districts. I don't know that we've specifically asked that those blocks be rezoned, and I think we need to talk to our elected.
Well, but in the resolution which I resent to you, Steve, that the community board passed, I think in January, and I think also in the letter that the community board sent, or that the board chair sent at the committee's suggestion to LPC in response to their, inattention to the request, is those two projects endanger the integrity of the Audubon Park District
Well, the
that
historic.
they designated.
Well, but separate out now the historic district issue. They've come back to us and said, where do you want to see the R8 district change?
Yeah, well, but that wasn't LPC that said that. City planning,
City planning, right.
in response to the rezoning.
Exactly. So my suggestion now is that we quickly respond to city planning and say, with respect to this particular area, which is now R8, we want to see it downzoned ASAP. I mean, I think we need to, we need to take them up on it quickly if we're going to have any effect at all on those two sites.
We can certainly do an initial response and then a more extensive response. We could say basically in the area from, West 158th Street, to 160, whatever, that, we recommend this, but the reality is,
well, I mean, let them know that we're looking at the rest of the community, but we have.
What I was pointing out is that the rezoning process still is not a process that happens quickly, but, we can certainly say that, in response to your inquiry, we had a broad discussion, and these are the things that, came out of it. And for that specific area where those projects are, this is what is currently recommended, and that we're continuing to refine that. But yes, we can certainly tell them that.
Yeah, let's respond in some way.
Jim?
I just want to get back into a few more technicalities. As I mentioned, we're very specific, and terminology is sometimes important about what we call a public hearing. But we have public information meetings that are less formal that would serve the purposes that we're talking about. But there's the other thing I want to caution you about is that, we can say the word survey very lightly, but there are whole industries out there devoted to doing surveys that are either more or less valid. And so, and there may even be, I know on the federal level, there are definitely restrictions, but maybe even on the municipal level, there are restrictions as to who can do surveys, what they can ask, what information they have to, give in advance. So we have to look into that. I'm not saying we shouldn't do it, but again, a survey that's not done well will probably give you misinformation, and that would be a disservice.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. But I would point out that when I think it was, city planning had initiated something on asking community residents, what's good urban design? And, that was that question was open for a period of time, and, folks could just go to the survey and tell city planning what they thought or what was good urban design in your community. So from community to community, it would vary, and you would say, so you're absolutely right. You can do a survey, a poll that is absolutely useless based upon how you phrase it. But if it's something akin to, we're looking at, trying to better define, urban design guidelines. We want, public input on what are their thoughts on what is, good urban design or good urban design practices, in your community. And you're just asking them to share that. It's not one of these political, push polls where you're sort of intentionally structuring the question to mislead folks. But I understand what you're saying. With that, it's 9:02. We've had, I think, a wonderful discussion on the contextual. As I mentioned, the Inwood section of the waterfront is next month. And I am assuming it will not just be land use, it probably will also be presented to, parks and culture, because at the end of the day, it's going to be outside park space.
But Wayne, what is meant by the Inwood section of the Greenway?
I do not know, Steve. And, we don't have the presentation. And one of my first questions I ask is, why is this necessarily something coming to land use? But I think it's one of the commitments from the Inwood rezoning. And since we've had a number of follow-ups on that, that's why they specifically asked to present it to land use. But I also pointed out that they probably also want to present it to Parks and Culture. So I was looking forward to learning more about, what it is exactly, your question, Steve, but I don't have any information on it.
All right. And so it's a presentation by EDC?
Steve? I don't have the information. It might be a combination of EDC and others. And, when I get it from the office, I will share it. I think the most we got was the name of the person who was supposed to be doing the presentation, although I don't know if they were doing it, if they were just the contact who was, coordinating with the office.
Possibly makes sense to be presented to Health and Environment.
You know what, land use is not going to take the lead in determining everyone who it is presented to. We will let them know that there are, as we've done on a number of occasions, there are multiple committees that have an interest in this, and they need to make sure that they touch base appropriately.
Thank you.
Bob Duquois. Is there a motion to adjourn?
No, 1 second.
Steve, enough.
No. Under old business.
What's old business?
With respect to the site at 29 Overlook Terrace, 524 Fort Washington, What, were we able to make contact with the?
No, actually, I was supposed to do that as an update. The office reports they've not had success in contacting the new owners for the site. They've reached out since the last meeting, but they have not made contact.
And did we get an answer from DOB as to whether the?
I do not have an answer from the office on whether permitting, but as I mentioned last month, I am pretty certain, as you know, a licensed architect, that you don't need a building permit to remove vegetation,
Right.
trash, and debris from a site.
Okay. I have one more suggestion for a topic for another meeting.
You mean like for September?
Maybe that we invite the developer of the radio tower and hotel to give us an update on what's going on with, I believe that site is now open. I'd be curious to know how it's been, how it's working out, who the new tenants might be, and what the occupancy is, and what's happening over there, and whether the initial the commitments that were made to us have now been fulfilled.
You know, I seem to recall that Isidro had mentioned something along that line a few general meetings ago. So I wonder if the licensing committee or the business development did that. I will reach out to Ebenezer to see if other committees have had, you know, the type of conversation that you're talking about.
Right, but, you know,
And see if we can get them to circle back to land use to do the same.
oh, very good. You'll recall the original resolution came out of our committee.
I absolutely do.
I move we adjourn.
Is there a second?
Second it.
Okay, it's 9:06 p.m. We're adjourned. Thank you all.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks, committee.
And of course, I encourage everyone to see us again next